I already told you to, though. I sold my house to my daughter and her husband. Listen, if you cross me, I'm divorcing you."
Upon hearing my husband's sudden words, I understood that his misunderstandings were still running wild. At the same time, I was speechless. My husband had convinced himself that he had a right to the house I inherited from my mother, and without consulting me, he proposed to sell it to her daughter and son-in-law. He had never valued my opinions before and always looked down on me, but I had had enough of his selfish behavior. "What? I inherited it from my mother, and it's originally her house, so why should it become yours?" When I asked him that, my husband just laughed smugly.
"Because what belongs to the wife also belongs to the husband," he said.
I wonder who could have put such an idea into his head. I couldn't find the words to express my disbelief as my husband confidently claimed that my mother's house was a shared asset between us. With my daughter and my son-in-law looking on guiltily, I decided it was time to teach my husband a lesson for his arrogance and refusal to listen. I made a call to a certain someone while giving my husband a sidelong glance. "I'm Amy. I'm turning 62 this year. Although I had originally planned to create a typical household, there were many things about my husband's words and actions that bothered me from the past. My husband has a habit of convincing himself that things are in his favor. For example, when our daughter was young, we took her to a festival and she happened to win a prize. He went around bragging to all of our relatives that he was the one who won the prize. This made our daughter very angry. When our daughter got accepted into a top university, my husband didn't say a word of encouragement during the time she was working hard and attending cram school, but after the results were announced, he suddenly turned around and boasted to everyone that
I was helping her with her studies,
which made both our daughter and myself quite exasperated. My husband had a habit of distorting his memory just to brag about himself. When I noticed and pointed it out, he would apologize right away, but as he got older, he became more stubborn and started believing his own assumptions without questioning them. Not only that, but he also called me a liar and accused me of saying things that suited only my own convenience. Recently, no matter what I say, he just brushes it off and says,
I haven't done anything wrong. You're the one at fault.
And as a result, we stopped talking to each other. Now that he's in his 60s, he only accepts things that are convenient for him. Lately, it seems that my husband has been influenced by a certain friend and is trying to act like a domineering husband who bosses around his wife. He no longer values my opinions and won't even listen to what I have to say.
You're lucky. You can always laze around at home and do whatever you want.
Don't forget that you're retired from work and are also doing things you enjoy, right?
Are you trying to call me lazy?
It sounds like you just want to say that about me, doesn't it?
I'm such a pitiful man for marrying a wife who acts so high and mighty, despite depending on someone else's earnings for a living.
Most of our conversations went like that. Whenever it didn't go his way, he would say things like,
even though she's just a wife, she acts so high and mighty, or, I'm such a pitiful man.
Even when their daughter tried to point out his terrible attitude, he would just snap back with,
who does she think she is, acting all high and mighty,
and refuse to listen to her. No matter how many times I scolded him, he would just brush it off with a,
yes, yes,
and go back to his old ways the next day. There was no way I could build a harmonious home with such an overbearing husband, and after our daughter got married and left the house, we spent our time in silence in our quiet home. One day, I received news from my brother that our mother had passed away. My father was already gone, and my brother and his wife had been living with my mother at our family home. I went to my mother's funeral with my family, and my brother consulted me about something there. Hey, about the house we used to live with Mom. Would you be willing to inherit it? Huh? Why? It's because of my wife's circumstances. We have to move out soon. I see. Okay. If that's what my big brother wants, I'll take the house. My brother asked me to inherit the house in exchange for him inheriting all the money. Apparently, he has to move out soon and doesn't have time to handle the paperwork. My brother told me the situation, and out of gratitude for taking care of my mom until now, I decided to accept his request. I also considered going ahead with the procedures to sell the house, but since it was a home that our family had lived in for a long time, I decided to keep it as it was for a while and think if there was any effective way to use it. I had no idea at the time that this event would later cause my husband to do something extraordinary. "Hey, Mom, Dad said he's going to sell us the house." "What? What do you mean? Dad is going to sell his house to us at a low price." "Sell the house? Did that man ever own a home?" After some time had passed since the funeral, my daughter suddenly told me about this. When I heard about selling the house, I thought of the house I inherited from my mother. I haven't talked to my husband about my conversation with my brother yet. Even if he had overheard us, I couldn't understand why my husband would bring up such a thing to our daughter and her husband. "But isn't it strange that he hasn't listened to your story, Mom? I mean, he usually leaves all that troublesome procedures to you." "Well, I wonder what he's talking about. Shall we ask him about it next time we see him?" After hearing this from my daughter, I was worried that my husband might do something selfish with the house I inherited. Just 3 days after hearing about it from my daughter, my husband immediately said,
"Invite our daughter and son-in-law over. I want to talk to them at our house."
"Hey, you're not talking about selling the house to our daughter and her husband by any chance, are you?"
"What? Are you listening to me? You have good ears. She's a shrewd woman when it comes to money."
"Whose house are you planning to sell?"
"Obviously, it's my house, right?"
I frowned at my husband's words. The only house my husband owns, or any other house, should be the one we are living in now. I thought he was going to move in with his daughter and her husband. But my husband insisted that he was selling my house and wouldn't listen, saying it was his house.
"Listen, you don't have the right to tell me what to do. I'm free to do what I want with my house."
My husband looked down on me and talked down to me, and I couldn't seem to get through to him. I let out a sigh. Though he claimed that I had no right to have a say in the matter, I was worried about his tendency to jump to conclusions. Seeing that my husband was not willing to listen to my opinion, I became concerned about his plans and decided to make a phone call to someone. 1 week later, my daughter and her husband came to visit us at our house. In contrast to me, whose face was cloudy from anxiety, my daughter smiled when she saw me. "What's going on? You seem to be in a good mood." "Hey, Mom, actually, I'm pregnant." "Oh my, really? Congratulations." While stroking her still not very visible belly, my daughter happily announced her pregnancy to me. Seeing my daughter's husband also taking her hand and nodding with a smile, even I began to feel happy. However, the peaceful atmosphere was easily shattered by a loud cough from my husband, who arrived later.
"Stop chatting at the entrance and come inside the living room already."
The two fell silent in response to my husband's arm-crossed, bossy words. I guided the two of them to the living room while making small talk. My husband sat on the sofa, crossing his legs and leaning back, and began talking about himself without listening to my daughter's news.
"I already told them, but I sold our house to our daughter and son-in-law."
Hey, I heard you say that before, but whose house are you talking about exactly?"
"I told you, it's my inherited house. If you go against me, it's a divorce."
Upon hearing my husband's words, I realized once again that he was lost in his own delusions. At the same time, my mouth hung open in shock. I can understand him insisting that it's our home, to a certain extent. However, the fact that he insists that it's his house has even my daughter's husband puzzled. "What? I inherited it, and the house was my mother's to begin with, remember? Why should it be yours?"
"Of course that's because what's my wife's is also mine."
I wonder who's filling his head with this kind of stuff. I couldn't find the words when my husband confidently declared the inherited home from my mother as our shared property. Thinking he had won the argument with logic, my husband laughed at me disdainfully. My husband squinted at me as if pitying my lack of education and grinned at me. I couldn't help but hold my head in frustration and asked my husband again slowly, "Listen, it's the house that I inherited from my parents. Why do you have the right to decide?"
"What are you talking about? Don't you even understand that?"
Anyway, I made an effort to explain it to my husband in simpler terms. It seemed that my daughter and her husband understood that my husband had no rights. However, my husband, who always criticized me with his stubbornness, didn't listen even after I explained it to him multiple times.
"Oh, I see. You just want to keep the inheritance all to yourself. You're a greedy woman, really."
"If it's our marital property, don't make decisions on your own."
"You didn't even get any money because you were fooled by your own brother, right? What good will it do to leave it to someone like you who doesn't even know how to manage money?"
My husband seemed dissatisfied that I did not inherit any money, and he started talking like he had rights to things like money and the house. It made me feel angry, but I answered calmly. My brother didn't deceive me, and I agreed to this inheritance. You have no reason to interfere.
You really don't know how to support your husband. Fine then, you should just give up on inheriting that house.
My patience was finally at its limits with my husband's irrational words. Even my daughter and son-in-law scolded him for his behavior, but he refused to admit he was wrong. I felt something snapping inside me at the way he was so intimidating, even to his own daughter. After my anger had subsided, my mind became clear as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. My 6-year-old husband, who had been so infuriating just moments ago, now seemed like a child throwing a tantrum. I spoke to him calmly, as if talking to a child. Okay, you don't want to listen to us anymore, do you? Because we're on a completely different level of understanding. All you have to do is follow my lead from the beginning. Yes, alright, I guess I'll give up telling you what I'm going to do now. After interrupting my husband, I made a phone call to someone. My husband didn't like my attitude and yelled at me with flared nostrils.
Hey, who the hell are you calling?
You'll find out soon enough. Just about 5 minutes had passed since I hung up the phone when the intercom rang in the living room, and I headed towards the entrance. Sorry to bother you. It's okay, you can always count on me. I had contacted someone beforehand due to my anxiety that my husband might go out of control, and asked them to come near our house. The person who appeared when I opened the door to the living room caused my husband's face to turn pale and tremble instantly. What are you doing, this foolish brother of mine? Yes, the person I had asked to come was my husband's sister. I had heard that my husband had been scared of his sister for a long time and couldn't stand up to her. I never thought it would be so effective, but when I saw my husband, who had just changed his attitude and become quiet, I couldn't help but laugh.
Hey, why did you call my sister?
You wouldn't listen to me, so I just asked someone who I thought you would listen to. We had my husband's sister sit in front of my husband, who had shrunk in front of her, and resumed our conversation. But from here on out, it turned into my sister-in-law lecturing my husband, because what belongs to my wife should also be mine? So, have you ever shared even a little of your stuff with Amy?
I've handed over the salary I earned. I worked so hard until now, and this person has been leeching off my earnings.
You always say, I earn this, I earn that, but Amy has been managing with your low income, cooking meals, heating up bath water, and even cleaning the house for you. Have you ever expressed your gratitude for that?
It's normal for a wife to support her husband, isn't it?
What support can you expect when you act like a pompous kid with nothing but pride? Every time her brother-in-law says something, she responds with a crushing blow. At first, I thought my husband was a good guy, but seeing him hang his head and cower in front of his sister-in-law, my daughter and I couldn't help but exchange a wry smile.
Why do I have to be the only one to suffer like this? Chris was quiet and sweet. He had a nice wife. I should have gotten a wife like that.
Chris? Is this the Chris who is your classmate?
That's right. The guy could do whatever he wanted, but his wife would have listened to him.
Finally, my husband couldn't stand it anymore and started complaining like a whining child. He brought up the story of his friend, who was a domineering husband, and started calling me a bad wife. I decided to do something I had already made up my mind about when I heard his abusive words. But before I could say anything, my sister-in-law burst out laughing so loudly that she drowned out my husband's voice, and then she scolded him. Chris earns several times more than you, and is always grateful to his wife. He's not a domineering husband. They have a relationship of trust, which is why she supports him. He's nothing like a useless man like you, who just complains about everything. As soon as she finished speaking, my sister-in-law burst out laughing again. My husband had a mixture of embarrassment and regret on his face, but he couldn't say anything in response. He just looked down and sulked. So, can we start over and forget about me selling the house I inherited? I knew something was off. That stingy father of mine selling us the house cheaply? No way. I'm sorry for doing something so selfish. No need to apologize. It's all my foolish brother's fault. My sister-in-law said happily to my daughter and son-in-law. Just as I thought the discussion was finally over, my husband came over to me and whispered this in my ear.
Hey, since I've given up on selling the house to our daughter, why don't you just sell it instead?
Why?
Why? Because if we make money, I'll get a cut too, right? We're a married couple, after all.
As soon as he realized he couldn't sell the house on his own, he started thinking about this kind of thing. He really wants a share of the profits. Just a little while ago, he was calling me a greedy woman, and now he's saying this? It makes me angry. I wonder if he forgot how terribly he was speaking to me during this discussion. Disgusted by his attitude, I couldn't even bring myself to speak, so I handed him a piece of paper instead. You won't be able to say that when you're a stranger. What I handed my husband was a completed divorce form. I've been wary of my husband's attitude for a while now, but today was the limit. He ignored our daughter's pregnancy announcement and treated me in a way that made me feel like he wasn't even part of the family. I had already written up the divorce form and asked my sister-in-law for help. I had made up my mind to slap it down on my husband if he acted selfishly again. Sure enough, my husband acted just as expected, and at this point, I had no more feelings for him.
Are you divorcing me? You're going to be a stranger. Are you sure?
It's fine. In fact, I want you to. I don't need a husband who only cares about his pride and ignores me.
I won't give you any money. My savings are mine.
That's fine. Well, then, goodbye. With my sister-in-law as a witness, I had my husband sign the divorce papers on the spot. My daughter was a little pale from the overwhelming momentum and apologized to me as if it was her fault. However, I had been considering divorce for a long time and told my daughter that I had no regrets, even though it may have seemed impulsive. And so, pretending not to notice that my husband seemed to want to say something, I went to submit the divorce papers early the next morning. A few days later, after I filed for divorce, my ex-husband was again pleased that I was becoming a stranger. However, within a few weeks of my moving out, he started calling to ask me to take care of things around the house that he couldn't manage.
Hey, the house is a mess. Come cook and clean. Take out the trash.
Why should I? I'm not going to take care of someone else.
You're still my wife, aren't you?
Ex-wife, have you forgotten that I filed for divorce already? Since he had never helped with household chores before, it was easy to imagine that things would turn out this way. However, my ex-husband himself didn't seem to realize this. Despite having divorced and becoming strangers, my ex-husband tried to take advantage of me, so I kindly informed my ex-sister-in-law about the phone calls I was receiving. He pretended to be a domineering husband, but he was a useless man who couldn't live without his wife. How could he act so high and mighty? My ex-husband was promptly knocked down by my former sister-in-law again, and the phone call stopped abruptly. Instead, I received a reassuring message from my former sister-in-law saying, "Don't worry, I'll keep an eye on my foolish brother." I learned from my former sister-in-law that my ex-husband had actually incurred some debts. Apparently, after trying to sell the house to my daughter and son-in-law, he had spent a lot of money in anticipation of a large sum of money coming his way. Perhaps he couldn't bear to admit to me, whom he looked down upon, that he had debts. Maybe it was fortunate that we divorced before my ex-husband brought up this issue. As for me, I inherited a portion of my mother's estate after my brother informed me of the divorce, and I now live in the house she left behind. It seems like I haven't actually seen my ex-husband in person since the divorce, but my brother and son-in-law, who have since had a child, have been visiting me frequently at this house. I don't want him to turn out like my father. Don't worry, you're an honest child, so this child will grow up honest too. But I'm worried about raising my kids. How did you do it? I haven't done anything special, but you managed to grow up splendidly. That's just how children are. While holding my grandchild, whose eyes resembled my daughter's, I savored my happiness. Seeing my anxious daughter's face, I told my grandchild, "You don't have to be splendid. Just please, become a sincere person." My daughter has become the sincere person I hoped for. Furthermore, she has grown up splendidly, enough to start a family of her own. I will cherish my mother's home while looking forward to my grandchild's future growth.